Musk spent months pacing around his home in Los Angeles late at night thinking about these plans for Mars and bouncing them off Riley, whom he remarried near the end of 2012. I mean, there aren't that many people you can talk to about this sort of thing, Musk said. These chats included Musk daydreaming aloud about becoming the first man to set foot on the red planet. He definitely wants to be the first man on Mars, Riley said. I have begged him not to be. Perhaps Musk enjoys teasing his wife, or maybe he's playing coy, but he denied this ambition during one of our late-night chats. I would only be on the first trip to Mars if I was confident that SpaceX would be fine if I die, he said. I'd like to go, but I don't have to go. The point is not about me visiting Mars but about enabling large numbers of people to go to the planet. Musk may not even go into space. He does not plan to participate in SpaceX's upcoming human test flights. I don't think that would be wise, he said. It would be like the head of Boeing being a test pilot for a new plane. It's not the right thing for SpaceX or the future of space exploration. I might be on there if it's been flying for 3 or 4 years. Honestly, if I never go to space, that will be okay. The point is to maximize the probable lifespan of humanity. It's difficult to gauge just how seriously the average person takes Musk when he talks like this. A few years ago, most people would have lumped him into the category of people who hype up jetpacks and robots and whatever else Silicon Valley decided to fixate on for the moment. Then Musk filed away one accomplishment after another, transforming himself from big talker to one of Silicon Valley's most revered doers. Thiel has watched Musk go through this maturation, from the driven but insecure CEO of PayPal to a confident CEO who commands the respect of thousands. I think there are ways he has dramatically improved over time, said Thiel. Most impressive to Thiel has been Musk's ability to find bright, ambitious people and lure them to his companies. He has the most talented people in the aerospace industry working for him, and the same case can be made for Tesla, where, if you are a talented mechanical engineer who likes building cars, then you are going to Tesla because it's probably the only company in the US where you can do interesting new things. Both companies were designed with this vision of motivating a critical mass of talented people to work on inspiring things. Thiel thinks Musk's goal of getting humans to Mars should be taken seriously and believes it gives the public hope. Not everyone will identify with the mission, but the fact that there's someone out there pushing exploration and our technical abilities to their limits is important. The goal of sending a man to Mars is so much more inspiring than what other people are trying to do in space, Thiel said. It's this going back to the future idea. There's been this long wind down of the space program, and people have abandoned the optimistic visions of the future that we had in the early 1970s. SpaceX shows there is a way toward bringing back that future. There's great value in what Elon is doing. The true believers came out in full force in August 2013 when Musk unveiled something called the Hyperloop. Billed as a new mode of transportation, this machine was a large-scale pneumatic tube like the ones used to send mail around offices. Musk proposed linking cities like Los Angeles and San Francisco via an elevated version of this kind of tube that would transport people and cars in pods. Similar ideas had been proposed before, but Musk's creation had some unique elements. He called for the tube to run under low pressure and for the pods to float on a bed of air produced by skis at their base. Each pod would be thrust forward by an electromagnetic pulse, and motors placed throughout the tube would give the pods added boosts as needed. These mechanisms could keep the pods going at 800 miles per hour, allowing someone to travel from Los Angeles to San Francisco in about 30 minutes. The whole thing would, of course, be solar-powered and aimed at linking cities less than 1,000 miles apart. It makes sense for things like LA to San Francisco, New York to DC, New York to Boston, Musk said at the time. Over 1,000 miles, the tube cost starts to become prohibitive, and you don't want tubes every which way. You don't want to live in tube land. Musk had been thinking about the Hyperloop for a number of months, describing it to friends in private. The first time he talked about it to anyone outside of his inner circle was during one of our interviews. Musk told me that the idea originated out of his hatred for California's proposed high-speed Rail system. The $60 billion bullet train they're proposing in California would be the slowest bullet train in the world at the highest cost per mile, Musk said. They're going for records in all the wrong ways. California's high-speed rail is meant to allow people to go from Los Angeles to San Francisco in about 2.5 hours upon its completion in, wait for it, 2029. It takes about an hour to fly between the cities today and 5 hours to drive, placing the train right in the zone of mediocrity, which particularly gnawed at Musk. He insisted the Hyperloop would cost about $6 billion to $10 billion. Go faster than a plane, and let people drive their cars onto a pod and drive out into a new city. At the time, it seemed that Musk had dished out the Hyperloop proposal just to make the public and legislators rethink the high-speed train. He didn't actually intend to build the thing. It was more that he wanted to show people that more creative ideas were out there for things that might actually solve problems and push the state forward. With any luck, the high-speed rail would be cancelled. Musk said as much to me during a series of emails and phone calls leading up to the announcement. Down the road, I might fund our advice on a Hyperloop project, but right now I can't take my eye off the ball at either SpaceX or Tesla, he wrote. Musk's tune, however, started to change after he released the paper detailing the Hyperloop. Bloomberg Businessweek had the first story on it, and the magazine's web server began melting down as people stormed the website to read about the invention. Twitter went nuts as well. About an hour after Musk released the information, he held a conference call to talk about the Hyperloop, and somewhere in between our numerous earlier chats and that moment, he'd decided to build the thing, telling reporters that he would consider making at least a prototype to prove that the technology could work. Some people had their fun with all of this. Billionaire and Whale's imaginary space train, teased Valleywag. We love Elon Musk's nutso determination. There was certainly a time when electric cars and private space flight seemed silly, too. But what's sillier is treating this as anything other than a very rich man's wild imagination. Unlike its early Tesla bashing days, Valleywag was now the minority voice. People seemed mainly to believe Musk could do it. The depth to which people believed it, I think, surprised Musk and forced him to commit to the prototype. In a weird life-imitating art moment, Musk really had become the closest thing the world had to Tony Stark, and he could not let his adoring public down. Shortly after the release of the Hyperloop plans, Sherwin Pishevar, an investor and friend of Musk's, brought the detailed specifications for the technology with him during a 90-minute meeting with President Obama at the White House. The president fell in love with the idea, Pishevar said. The president's staff studied the documents and arranged a one-on-one with Musk and Obama in April 2014. Since then, Pishevar, Kevin Brogan, and others have formed a company called Hyperloop Technologies, Inc. with the hopes of building the first leg of the Hyperloop between Los Angeles and Las Vegas. In theory, people would be able to hop between the two cities in about 10 minutes. Nevada Senator Harry Reid has been briefed on the idea as well, and efforts are underway to buy the land rights alongside Interstate 15 that would make the high-speed transport possible for employees like Gwynne Shotwell and J.B. Strobel. Working with Musk means helping develop these sorts of wonderful technologies in relative obscurity. They're the steady hands that will forever be expected to stay in the shadows. Shotwell has been a consistent presence at SpaceX almost since day one, pushing the company forward and suppressing her ego to ensure that Musk gets all the attention he desires. If you're Shotwell and truly believe in the cause of sending people to Mars, then the mission takes precedence over personal desires. Strobel, likewise, has been the constant at Tesla, a go-between, whom other employees could rely on to carry messages to Musk, and the guy who knows everything about the cars. Despite his stature at the company, Strobel was one of several longtime employees who confessed they were nervous to speak with me on the record. Musk likes to be the guy talking on his company's behalf and comes down hard on even his most loyal executives if they say something deemed to be out of line with Musk's views or with what he wants the public to think. Strobel has dedicated himself to making electric cars and didn't want some dumb reporter wrecking his life's work. I try really hard to back away and put my ego aside, Strobel said. Elon is incredibly difficult to work for, but it's Mostly because he's so passionate. He can be impatient and say, "God damn it. This is what we have to do." And some people will get shell-shocked and catatonic. It seems like people can get afraid of him and paralyzed in a weird way. I try to help everyone to understand what his goals and visions are, and then I have a bunch of my own goals, too, and make sure we're in sync. Then, I try and go back and make sure the company is aligned. Ultimately, Elon is the boss. He has driven this thing with his blood, sweat, and tears. He has risked more than anyone else. I respect the hell out of what he has done. It just could not work without Elon. In my view, he has earned the right to be the front person for this thing. The rank-and-file employees tend to describe Musk in more mixed ways. They revere his drive and respect how demanding he can be. They also think he can be hard to the point of mean and come off as capricious. The employees want to be close to Musk, but they also fear that he'll suddenly change his mind about something and that every interaction with him is an opportunity to be fired. Elon's worst trait, by far, in my opinion, is a complete lack of loyalty or human connection, said one former employee. Many of us worked tirelessly for him for years and were tossed to the curb like a piece of litter without a second thought. Maybe it was calculated to keep the rest of the workforce on their toes and scared, maybe. He was just able to detach from human connection to a remarkable degree. What was clear is that people who worked for him were like ammunition, used for a specific purpose until exhausted and discarded. The communications departments of SpaceX and Tesla have witnessed the latter forms of behavior more than any other group of employees. Musk has burned through public relations staffers with comical efficiency. He tends to take on a lot of the communications work himself, writing news releases and contacting the press as he sees fit. Quite often, Musk does not let his communications staff in on his agenda. Ahead of the Hyperloop announcement, for example, his representatives were sending me emails to find out the time and date for the press conference. On other occasions, reporters have received an alert about a teleconference with Musk just minutes before it started. This was not a function of the PR people being incompetent in getting word of the event out. The truth was that Musk had only let them know about his plans a couple of minutes in advance, and they were scrambling to catch up to his whims. When Musk does delegate work to the communications staff, they're expected to jump in without missing a beat and to execute at the highest level. Some of the staff, operating under this mix of pressure and surprise, only lasted between a few weeks and a few months. A few others have hung on for a couple of years before burning out or being fired. The granddaddy example of Musk's seemingly callous interoffice style occurred in early 2014 when he fired Mary Beth Brown. To describe her as a loyal executive assistant would be grossly inadequate. Brown often felt like an extension of Musk, the one being who crossed over into all of his worlds. For more than a decade, she gave up her life for Musk, traipsing back and forth between Los Angeles and Silicon Valley every week, while working late into the night and on weekends. Brown went to Musk and asked that she be compensated on par with SpaceX's top executives, since she was handling so much of Musk's scheduling across two companies, doing public relations work and often making business decisions. Musk replied that Brown should take a couple of weeks off, and he would take on her duties and gauge how hard they were. When Brown returned, Musk let her know that he didn't need her anymore. And he asked Shotwell's assistant to begin scheduling his meetings. Brown, still loyal and hurt, didn't want to discuss any of this with me. Musk said that she had become too comfortable speaking on his behalf and that, frankly, she needed a life. Other people grumbled that Brown and Riley clashed and that this was the root cause of Brown's ouster. Brown declined to be interviewed for this book, despite several requests. Whatever the case, the optics of the situation were terrible. Tony Stark doesn't fire Pepper Potts. He adores her and takes care of her for life. She's the only person he can really trust, the one who has been there through everything. That Musk was willing to let Brown go, and in such an unceremonious fashion, struck people inside SpaceX and Tesla is scandalous and is the ultimate confirmation of his cruel stoicism. The tale of Brown's departure became part of the lore around Musk's lack of empathy. It got bundled up into the stories of Musk dressing employees down in legendary fashion with Vicious Bob after Vicious Bob. People also linked this type of behavior to Musk's other quirky traits. He's been known to obsess over typos in emails to the point that he could not see past the errors and read the actual content of the messages. Even in social settings, Musk might get up from the dinner table without a word of explanation to head outside and look at the stars, simply because he's not willing to suffer fools or small talk. After adding up this behavior, dozens of people expressed to me their conclusion that Musk sits somewhere on the autism spectrum and that he has trouble considering other people's emotions and caring about their well-being. There's a tendency, especially in Silicon Valley, to label people who are a bit different or quirky as autistic or afflicted with Asperger's syndrome. It's armchair psychology for conditions that can be inherently funky to diagnose or even codify. To slap this label on Musk feels ill-informed and too easy. Musk acts differently with his closest friends and family than he does with employees, even those who have worked alongside him for a long time. Among his inner circle, Musk is warm, funny, and deeply emotional. Asterisk, he might not engage in the standard chit-chat, asking a friend how his kids are doing, but he would do everything in his considerable power to help that friend if his child was sick or in trouble. He will protect those close to him at all costs and, when deemed necessary, seek to destroy those who have wronged him or his friends. Musk's behavior matches up much more closely with someone who is described by neuropsychologists as profoundly gifted. These are people who in childhood exhibit exceptional intellectual depth and max out IQ tests. It's not uncommon for these children to look out into the world and find flaws, glitches in the system, and construct logical paths in their minds to fix them. For Musk, the call to ensure that mankind as a multiplanetary species partly stems from a life richly influenced by science fiction and technology. Equally, it's a moral imperative that dates back to his childhood. In some form, this has forever been his mandate. Each facet of Musk's life might be an attempt to soothe a type of existential depression that seems to gnaw at his every fiber. He sees man as self-limiting and in peril and wants to fix the situation. The people who suggest bad ideas during meetings or make mistakes at work are getting in the way of all of this and slowing Musk down. He does not dislike them as people. It's more that he feels pained by their mistakes, which have consigned man to peril that much longer. The perceived lack of emotion is a symptom of Musk sometimes feeling like he's the only one who really grasps the urgency of his mission. He's less sensitive and less tolerant than other people because the stakes are so high. Employees need to help solve the problems to the absolute best of their ability or they need to get out of the way. Musk has been pretty upfront about these tendencies. He's implored people to understand that he's not chasing momentary opportunities in the business world. He's trying to solve problems that have been consuming him for decades. During our conversations, Musk went back to this very point over and over again, making sure to emphasize just how long he'd thought about electric cars and space. The same patterns are visible in his actions as well. When Musk announced in 2014 that Tesla would open source all of its patents, analysts tried to decide whether this was a publicity stunt or if it hid an ulterior motive or a catch. But the decision was a straightforward one for Musk. He wants people to make and buy electric cars. Man's future, as he sees it, depends on this. If open sourcing Tesla's patents means other companies can build electric cars more easily, then that is good for mankind, and the ideas should be free. The cynic will scoff at this, and understandably so. Musk, however, has been programmed to behave this way and tends to be sincere when explaining his thinking, almost to a fault. The people who get closest to Musk are the ones who learn to relate to this mode of thinking. 22. They're the ones who can identify with his vision yet challenge him intellectually to complete it. When he asked me during one of our dinners if I thought he was insane, it was a test of sorts. We had talked enough that he knew I was interested in what he was doing. He had started to trust me and open up but wanted to make sure, one final time, that I truly grasped the importance of his quest. Many of his closest friends have passed much grander, more demanding tests. They've invested in his companies. They've defended him against critics. They helped him keep the wolves at bay during 2008. They've proven their loyalty and their commitment to his cause. People in the technology industry have tended to liken Musk's drive and the scope of his ambition to that of Bill Gates and Steve Jobs. Elon has that deep appreciation for technology, the no-holds-barred attitude of a visionary, and that determination to go after long-term things that they both had, said Edward Yoon, a child prodigy who worked for Jobs and Gates and ended up as Microsoft's chief software architect. And he has that consumer sensibility of Steve along with the ability to hire good people outside of his own comfort areas that's more like Bill. You almost wish that Bill and Steve had a genetically engineered love child, and, who knows, maybe we should genotype Elon to see if that's what happened. Steve Jurvetson, the venture capitalist who has invested in SpaceX, Tesla, and SolarCity, worked for Jobs, and knows Gates well, also described Musk as an upgraded mix of the two. Like Jobs, Elon does not tolerate C or D players, said Jurvetson. But I'd say he's nicer than Jobs and a bit more refined than Bill Gates. Asterisk. But the more you know about Musk, the harder it becomes to place him among his peers. Jobs is another CEO who ran two large industry-changing companies, Apple and Pixar. But that's where the practical similarities between the two men end. Jobs dedicated far more of his energy to Apple than Pixar, unlike Musk, who has poured equal energy into both companies, while saving whatever was left over for SolarCity. Jobs was also legendary for his attention to detail. No one, however, would suggest that his reach extended down as far as Musk's into overseeing so much of the company's day-to-day operations. Musk's approach has its limitations. He's less artful with marketing and media strategy. Musk does not rehearse his presentations or polish speeches. He wings most of the announcements from Tesla and SpaceX. He'll also fire off some major bit of news on a Friday afternoon when it's likely to get lost as reporters head home for the weekend, simply because that's when he finished writing the press release or wanted to move on to something else. Jobs, by contrast, treated every presentation and media moment as precious. Musk simply does not have the luxury to work that way. I don't have days to practice, he said. I've got to give impromptu talks, and the results may vary. As for whether Musk is leading the technology industry to new heights like Gates and Jobs, the professional pundits remain mixed. One camp holds that SolarCity, Tesla, and SpaceX offer little in the way of real hope for an industry that could use some blockbuster innovations. For the other camp, Musk is the real deal and the brightest shining star of what they see as a coming revolution in technology. The economist Tyler Cowen, who has earned some measure of fame in recent years for his insightful writings about the state of the technology industry and his ideas on where it may go, falls into that first camp. In The Great Stagnation, Cowen bemoaned the lack of big technological advances and argued that the American economy has slowed and wages have been depressed as a result. In a figurative sense, the American economy has enjoyed lots of low-hanging fruit since at least the 17th century, whether it be free land, lots of immigrant labor, or powerful new technologies, he wrote. Yet during the last 40 years, that low-hanging fruit started disappearing. And we started pretending it was still there. We have failed to recognize that we are at a technological plateau and the trees are more bare than we would like to think. That's it. That is what has gone wrong. In his next book, Average is Over, Cowen predicted an unromantic future in which a great divide had occurred between the haves and the have-nots. In Cowen's future, huge gains in artificial intelligence will lead to the elimination of many of today's high employment lines of work. The people who thrive in this environment will be very bright and able to complement the machines and team effectively with them. As for the unemployed masses, well, many of them will eventually find jobs going to work for the haves, who will employ teams of nannies, housekeepers, and gardeners. If anything Musk is doing might alter the course of mankind toward a rosier future, Cowen can't find it. Coming up with true breakthrough ideas is much harder today than in the past, according to Cowen, because we've already mined the bulk of the big discoveries. During a lunch in Virginia, Cowen described Musk not as a genius inventor but as an attention seeker, and not a terribly good one at that. I don't think a lot of people care about getting to Mars, he said. And it seems like a very expensive way to drive whatever breakthroughs you might get from it. Then, you hear about the Hyperloop. I don't think he has any intention of doing it. You have to wonder if it's not meant just to be publicity for his companies. As for Tesla, it might work. But you're still just pushing the problems back somewhere else. You still have to generate power. It could be that he is challenging convention less than people think. These sentiments are not far off from those of Vaclav Smil, a professor emeritus at the University of Manitoba. Bill Gates has hailed Smil as an important writer for his tomes on energy, the environment, and manufacturing. One of Smil's latest works is Made in the USA, an exploration of America's past manufacturing glories and its subsequent, dismal loss of industry. Anyone who thinks the United States is making a natural, clever shift away from manufacturing and toward higher-paying information worker jobs will want to read this book and have a gander at the long-term consequences of this change. Smil presents numerous examples of the ways in which the manufacturing industry generates major innovations and creates a massive ecosystem of jobs and technical smarts around them. For example, when some 3 decades ago the United States stopped making virtually all commodity, consumer electronic devices and displays, it also lost its capacity to develop and mass-produce advanced flat screens and batteries, 2 classes of products that are quintessential for portable computers and cell phones and whose large-scale imports keep adding to the US trade deficit, Smil wrote. A bit later in the book, Smil emphasized that the aerospace industry, in particular, has been a huge boon to the US economy and one of its major exporters. Maintaining the sector's competitiveness must be a key component of efforts to boost US exports, and the exports will have to be a large part of the sector's sales because the world's largest aerospace market of the next 2 decades will be in Asia, above all in China and India, and American aircraft and aero-engine makers should benefit from this expansion. Smil is consumed by the United States' waning ability to compete with China and yet does not perceive Musk or his companies as any sort of counter to the slide. As, among other things, a historian of technical advances, I simply must see Tesla as nothing but an utterly derivative overhyped toy for show-offs. Smil wrote to me. The last thing a country with 50 million people on food stamps and $85 billion deeper into debt every month needs is anything to do with space, especially space with more joyrides for the super rich. And the loop proposal was nothing but bamboozling people who do not know anything about kindergarten physics with a very old, long-publicized Gedanken experiment in kinetics. There are many inventive Americans, but in that lineup Musk would be trailing far behind. The comments were blunt and surprising given some of the things Smil celebrated in his recent book. He spent a good deal of time showing the positive impact that Henry Ford's vertical integration had on advancing the car industry and the American economy. He also wrote at length about the rise of Mechatronic machines, or machines that rely on a lot of electronics and software. By 2010, the electronic controls for a typical sedan required more lines of software code than the instructions needed to operate the latest Boeing jetliner, Smil wrote. American manufacturing has turned modern cars into remarkable mechatronic machines. The first decade of the 21st century also brought innovations, ranging from the deployment of new materials, carbon composites in aviation, nanostructures, to wireless electronics. There's a tendency among critics to dismiss Musk as a frivolous dreamer that stems first and foremost from a misunderstanding of what Musk is actually doing. People like Smil seem to catch an article or television show that hits on Musk's quest to get to Mars and immediately lump him with the space tourism crowd. Musk, though, hardly ever talks about tourism and has, since day one, built up SpaceX to compete at the industrial end of the space business. If Smil thinks Boeing selling planes is crucial to the American economy, then he should be enthused about what SpaceX has managed to accomplish in the commercial launch market. SpaceX builds its products in the United States, has made dramatic advances in aerospace technology, and has made similar advances in materials and manufacturing techniques. It would not take much to argue that SpaceX is America's only hope of competing against China in the next couple of decades. As for mechatronic machines, SpaceX and Tesla have set the example of fusing together electronics, software, and metal that their rivals are now struggling to match. And all of Musk's companies, including SolarCity, have made dramatic use of vertical integration and turned in-house control of components into a real advantage. To get a sense of how powerful Musk's work may end up being for the American economy, have a think about the dominant mechatronic machine of the past several years, the smartphone. Pre-iPhone, the United States was the laggard in the telecommunications industry. All of the exciting cell phones and mobile services were in Europe and Asia, while American consumers bumbled along with dated equipment. When the iPhone arrived in 2007, it changed everything. Apple's device mimicked many of the functions of a computer and then added new abilities with its apps, sensors, and location awareness. Google charged to market with its Android software and related handsets, and the United States suddenly emerged as the driving force in the mobile industry. Smartphones were revolutionary because of the ways they allowed hardware, software, and services to work in unison. This was a mix that favored the skills of Silicon Valley. The rise of the smartphone led to a massive industrial boom in which Apple became the most valuable company in the country, and billions of its clever devices were spread all over the world. Tony Fadell, the former Apple executive credited with bringing the iPod and iPhone to market, has characterized the smartphone as representative of a type of super cycle in which hardware and software have reached a critical point of maturity. Electronics are good and cheap, while software is more reliable and sophisticated. Their interplay is now resulting in science fiction-worthy ideas we were promised long ago becoming a reality. Google has its self-driving cars and has acquired dozens of robotics companies as it looks to merge code and machine. Fadell's company Nest has its intelligent thermostats and smoke alarms. General Electric has jet engines packed full of sensors taught to proactively report possible anomalies to its human mechanics. And a host of startups have begun infusing medical devices with powerful software to help people monitor and analyze their bodies and diagnose conditions. Tiny satellites are being put into orbit 20 at a time, and instead of being given a fixed task for their entire lifetimes, like their predecessors, they're being reprogrammed on the fly for a wide variety of business and scientific tasks. Z-Aero, a startup in Mountain View, has a couple of former SpaceX staffers on hand and is working on a secretive new type of transport. A flying car at last. Perhaps, for Fadell, Musk's work sits at the highest end of this trend. He could have just made an electric car, Fadell said, but he did things like use motors to actuate the door handles. He's bringing the consumer electronics and the software together, and the other car companies are trying to figure out a way to get there, whether it's Tesla or SpaceX taking Ethernet cables and running them inside of rocket ships. You are talking about combining the old world science of manufacturing with low-cost, consumer-grade technology. You put these things together, and they morph into something we have never seen before. All of a sudden there is a wholesale change, he said. It's a step function. To the extent that Silicon Valley has searched for an inheritor to Steve Jobs' role as the dominant guiding force of the technology industry, Musk has emerged as the most likely candidate. He's certainly the it guy of the moment. Startup founders, proven executives, and legends hold him up as the person they most admire. The more mainstream Tesla can become, the more Musk's reputation will rise. A hot-selling Model 3 would certify Musk as that rare being able to rethink an industry, read consumers, and execute. From there, his more fanciful ideas start to seem inevitable. Elon is one of the few people that I feel is more accomplished than I am, said Craig Venter, the man who decoded the human genome and went on to create synthetic life forms. At some point he hopes to work with Musk on a type of DNA printer that could be sent to Mars. It would, in theory, allow humans to create medicines, food, and helpful microbes for early settlers of the planet. I think biological teleportation is what is going to truly enable the colonization of space, he said. Elon and I have been talking about how this might play out. One of Musk's most ardent admirers is also one of his best friends, Larry Page, the co-founder and CEO of Google. Page has ended up on Musk's house surfing schedule. He's kind of homeless, which I think is sort of funny, Page said. He'll email and say, I don't know where to stay tonight. Can I come over? I haven't given him a key or anything yet. Google has invested more than just about any other technology company into Musk's sort of moonshot projects. Self-driving cars, robots, and even a cash prize to get a machine onto the moon cheaply. The company, however, operates under a set of constraints and expectations that come with employing tens of thousands of people and being analyzed constantly by investors. It's with this in mind that Page sometimes feels a bit envious of Musk, who has managed to make radical ideas the basis of his companies. If you think about Silicon Valley or corporate leaders in general, they're not usually lacking in money, Page said. If you have all this money, which presumably you are going to give away and couldn't even spend it all if you wanted to, why then are you devoting your time to a company that's not really doing anything good? That's why I find Elon to be an inspiring example. He said, well, what should I really do in this world? Solve cars, global warming, and make humans multiplanetary. I mean, those are pretty compelling goals. And now he has businesses to do that. This becomes a competitive advantage for him, too. Why would you want to work for a defense contractor when you can work for a guy who wants to go to Mars and he's going to move heaven and earth to make it happen? You can frame a problem in a way that's really good for the business. At one point, a quotation from Page made the rounds, saying that he wanted to leave all of his money to Musk. Page felt he was misquoted but stood by the sentiment. I'm not leaving my money to him at the moment, Page said. But Elon makes a pretty compelling case for having a multiplanetary society just because, otherwise we might all die, which seems like it would be sad for all sorts of different reasons. I think it's a very doable project, and it's a relatively modest resource that we need to set up a permanent human settlement on Mars. I was just trying to make the point that that's a really powerful idea. As Page puts it, good ideas are always crazy until they're not. It's a principle he's tried to apply at Google. When Page and Sergey Brin began wondering aloud about developing ways to search the text inside of books, all of the experts they consulted said it would be impossible to digitize every book. The Google co-founders decided to run the numbers and see if it was actually physically possible to scan the books in a reasonable amount of time. They concluded it was, and Google has since scanned millions of books. I've learned that your intuition about things you don't know that much about isn't very good, Page said. The way Elon talks about this is that you always need to start with the first principles of a problem. What are the physics of it? How much time will it take? How much will it cost? How much cheaper can I make it? There's this level of engineering and physics that you need to make judgments about what's possible and interesting. Elon is unusual in that he knows that, and he also knows business and organization and leadership and governmental issues. Some of the conversations between Musk and Page take place at a secret apartment Google owns in downtown Palo Alto. It's inside of one of the taller buildings in the area and offers views of the mountains surrounding the Stanford University campus. Page and Brin will take private meetings at the apartment and have their own chef on call to prepare food for guests. When Musk is present, the chats tend toward the absurd and fantastic. I was there once, and Elon was talking about building an electric jet plane that can take off and land vertically, said George Zachary, the venture capitalist and friend of Musk's. Larry said the plane should be able to land on ski slopes, and Sergey said it needed to be able to dock at a port in Manhattan. Then they started talking about building a commuter plane that was always circling the earth, and you'd hop up to it and get places incredibly fast. I thought everyone was kidding. But at the end I asked Elon, are you really going to do that? And he said, yes. It's kind of our recreation, I guess, said Page. 23. It's fun for the three of us to talk about kind of crazy things, and we find stuff that eventually turns out to be real. We go through hundreds or thousands of possible things before arriving at the ones that are most promising. Page talked about Musk at times as if he were a one of a kind, a force of nature able to accomplish things in the business world that others would never even try. We think of SpaceX and Tesla as being these tremendously risky things, but I think Elon was going to make them work no matter what. He's willing to suffer some personal cost, and I think that makes his odds actually pretty good. If you knew him personally, you would look back to when he started the companies and say his odds of success would be more than 90%. I mean, we just have a single proof point now that you can be really passionate about something that other people think is crazy and you can really succeed. And you look at it with Elon. And you say, well, maybe it's not luck. He's done it twice. It can't be luck totally. I think that means it should be repeatable in some sense. At least it's repeatable by him. Maybe we should get him to do more things. Page holds Musk up as a model he wishes others would emulate, a figure that should be replicated. During a time in which the businessmen and politicians have fixated on short-term, inconsequential goals, I don't think we are doing a good job as a society deciding what things are really important to do, Page said. I think like we are just not educating people in this kind of general way. You should have a pretty broad engineering and scientific background. You should have some leadership training and a bit of MBA training or knowledge of how to run things, organize stuff, and raise money. I don't think most people are doing that, and it's a big problem. Engineers are usually trained in a very fixed area. When you are able to think about all of these disciplines together, you kind of think differently and can dream of much crazier things and how they might work. I think that's really an important thing for the world. That's how we make progress. The pressure of feeling the need to fix the world takes its toll on Musk's body. There are times when you run into Musk and he looks utterly exhausted. He does not have bags under his eyes but rather deep, shadowy valleys. During the worst of times, following weeks of sleep deprivation, his eyes seem to have sunk back into his skull. Musk's weight moves up and down with the stress, and he's usually heavier when really overworked. It's funny in a way that Musk spends so much time talking about man's survival but isn't willing to address the consequences of what his lifestyle does to his body. Elon came to the conclusion early in his career that life is short, Strobel said. If you really embrace this, it leaves you with the obvious conclusion that you should be working as hard as you can. Suffering, though, has always been Musk's thing. The kids at school tortured him. His father played brutal mind games. Musk then abused himself by working inhumane hours and forever pushing his businesses to the edge. The idea of work-life balance seems meaningless in this context. For Musk, it's just life, and his wife and kids try to fit into the show where they can. I'm a pretty good dad, Musk said. I have the kids for slightly more than half the week and spend a fair bit of time with them. I also take them with me when I go out of town. Recently, we went to the Monaco Grand Prix and were hanging out with the Prince and Princess of Monaco. It all seemed quite normal to the kids, and they were blasé about it. They're growing up having a set of experiences that are extremely unusual, but you don't realize experiences are unusual until you are much older. They're just your experiences. They have good manners at meals. It bothers Musk a bit that his kids won't suffer like he did. He feels that the suffering helped to make him who he is and gave him extra reserves of strength and will. They might have a little adversity at school, but these days schools are so protective, he said. If you call someone a name, you get sent home. When I was going to school, if they punched you and there was no blood, it was like, whatever. Shake it off. Even if there was a little blood, but not a lot, it was fine. What do I do? Create artificial adversity. How do you do that? The biggest battle I have is restricting their video game time because they want to play all the time. The rule is they have to read more than they play video games. They also can't play completely stupid video games. There's one game they downloaded recently called Cookizo something. You literally tap a fucking cookie. It's like a Psych 101 experiment. I made them delete the cookie game. They had to play Flappy Golf instead, which is like Flappy Bird, but at least there is some physics involved. Musk has talked about having more kids, and it's on this subject that he delivers some controversial philosophizing with the creator of Beavis and Butthead. There's this point that Mike Judge makes. In Idiocracy, which is like smart people, should at least sustain their numbers, Musk said. Like, if it's a negative Darwinian vector, then obviously that's not a good thing. It should be at least neutral. But if each successive generation of smart people has fewer kids, that's probably bad too. I mean, Europe, Japan, Russia, China are all headed for demographic implosion. And the fact of the matter is that basically wealth, education, and being secular are all indicative of low birth rate. They all correlate with low birth rate. I'm not saying like only smart people should have kids. I'm just saying that smart people should have kids as well. They should at least maintain, at least be a replacement rate. And the fact of the matter is that I noticed that a lot of really smart women have 0 or 1 kid. You're like, wow, that's probably not good. The next decade of Musk company should be quite something. Musk has given himself a chance to become one of the greatest businessmen and innovators of all time. By 2025, Tesla could very well have a lineup of 5 or 6 cars and be the dominant force in a booming electric car market. Playing off its current growth rate, SolarCity will have had time to emerge as a massive utility company and the leader in a solar market that had finally lived up to its promise. SpaceX, well, it's perhaps the most intriguing. According to Musk's calculations, SpaceX should be conducting weekly flights to space, carrying humans and cargo, and have put most of its competitors out of business. Its rockets should be capable of doing a couple of laps around the moon and then landing with pinpoint accuracy back at the spaceport in Texas. And preparation for the first few dozen trips to Mars should be well underway. If all of this were taking place, Musk, then in his mid-50s, likely would be the richest man in the world and among its most powerful. He would be the majority shareholder in 3 public companies, and history would be preparing to smile broadly on what he had accomplished. During a time in which countries and other businesses were paralyzed by indecision and inaction, Musk would have mounted the most viable charge against global warming, while also providing people with an escape plan, just in case. He would have brought a substantial amount of crucial manufacturing back to the United States, while also providing an example for other entrepreneurs hoping to harness a new age of wonderful machines. As Thiel said, Musk may well have gone so far as to give people hope and to have renewed their faith in what technology can do for mankind. This future, of course, remains precarious. Huge technological issues confront all 3 of Musk's companies. He's bet on the inventiveness of man and the ability of solar, battery, and aerospace technology to follow predicted price and performance curves. Even if these bets hit as he hopes, Tesla could face a weird, unexpected recall. SpaceX could have a rocket carrying humans blow up, an incident that could very well end the company on the spot. Dramatic risks accompany just about everything Musk does. By the time our last dinner had come around, I had decided that this propensity for risk had little to do with Musk being insane, as he had wondered aloud several months earlier. No, Musk just seems to possess a level of conviction that is so intense and exceptional as to be off-putting to some. As we shared some chips and guacamole and cocktails, I asked Musk directly just how much he was willing to put on the line. His response: everything that other people hold dear. I would like to die on Mars, he said. Just not on impact. Ideally, I'd like to go for a visit, come back for a while, and then go there when I'm like 70 or something and then just stay there. If things turn out well, that would be the case. If my wife and I have a bunch of kids, she would probably stay with them on Earth.